Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidents. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments, and rumors of my demise are greatly exaggerated. I apologize that we missed last Friday's episode, and I'm sorry the cadence has been a little bit off, but I'm back at my desk, and I'm not supposed to go anywhere for a whole 6 to 7 weeks, which I'm really looking forward to. So we recorded this episode yesterday, actually, Tuesday, May 9th. We're pushing it out today because we missed last Friday's episode. Rob and I will be back at it this week. And then hopefully we'll, knock on wood, be good going forward. I thank you all and appreciate your patience. Joining me on the podcast today is Ryan Bohl. He is a senior Middle East and North Africa analyst at the RAIN Network, the artist formerly known as Stratfor. I actually never worked with Ryan at Stratfor. We were just tweeting at each other the other day, and I said, hey, how about you come on the podcast? And he was good enough to make some time. So we have a conversation really looking all around the Middle East at a very high level, and hopefully Ryan will come back on and share some more insights on a more granular level as well, because I think this is a region that's going to be changing a lot here in the coming years. So thank you to Ryan, thank you to Rain, thank you all for listening. If you haven't left a rating or a review on the podcast, please consider doing so, and as always, hit me up at jacob@cognitive.investments if you want to hear more about the research services we sell or our investment management services for individual clients or anything else you want me to know that's at the top of your mind. I read everything. So cheers and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right, well, let's make it rain, Ryan. It's good to have a Rain Stratfor acolyte that I didn't actually meet at my time there on the podcast. Thank you for making some time to talk about the calmest, least volatile region in the world, the Middle East.
Well, thanks for having me, Jacob.
Well, I don't even know where to start. So we're going to put this out fairly soon. So usually there's about a week lag between when we record and we push out. But we're going to push this out tomorrow for a lot of different reasons. So that allows me to open up by asking, Turkish elections are soon. We're following it very closely. I'm sure you're following it very closely. We're going to have a Monday reaction podcast with another former Stratforite, Emre. But how are you seeing the Turkish election right now? You can take that any way you want. If you want to talk about Erdogan's health, if you want to talk about the polls, which have told me absolutely nothing. I mean, just where do you think Turkish elections are going as of today, Tuesday, May 9th?
I will say, as a Middle East analyst, Turkey is particularly exciting on its elections because nobody else has elections in the region, let alone elections that matter, other than the Israelis, and they have too many elections. So right. Turkey is a unique electoral experience because, and I've heard this described before, it's a system that's not fair, but it is free. So there is an outside chance, maybe not even an outside chance, that President Erdogan and his Justice and Development Party don't win these polls in some form or another. And we're kind of gaming out those scenarios of what that looks like. And, thank God we don't have to call elections, but we do build scenarios around what the outcomes could be. And these will be the closest elections since the AKP took power in 2002. There's a great deal of uncertainty. There's no guarantee Erdogan will be the next president. And there's no guarantee that Erdogan will accept the results if they don't go his way, or that the AKP will accept the results in parliament if they don't go their way. There's an awful lot of volatility. And there's a moment here where Turkey could prove its democratic bona fides and has a peaceful transfer of power, and everyone can pat themselves on the back. Or it could go sideways, and we could see versions of a Turkish January 6th taking place in the coming weeks.
Well, so, I mean, you hit the nail right on the head. You got straight down to it. So what does that scenario look like if Erdogan, and I find it unlikely that he's going to, that Kılıçdaroğlu is going to win 50% outright in the first round, but it's possible. But either in the first round or the second round, if Erdogan loses, what do those scenarios look like for you that he wouldn't, quote unquote, accept it? Does it look like January 6th? Does it look more like Brazil's version of January 6th? Does it look like, hey, all these loyalists that I stacked the Turkish military with, I expect you to come and reinstall me into power? Does it look like civil war? How are you benchmarking what the scenarios are for that particular, that particular election result?
Right, and this is kind of I think of them as red dragon scenarios. This is low likelihood, but it's high impact if it happens. And in the Turkish context, if we're taking the January 6th example, Trump didn't control the electoral boards, which of course is spread across 50 states, and therefore it's very hard for a particular party to control those. In Turkey, the AKP controls the YSK, the Supreme Electoral Board, and it's staffed with their loyalists. So it will not be outside of the realm of imagination that in the second round, as you noted, it's probable that if Erdogan's going to go down, it'll happen in the second round. And for listeners, Turkey is an interesting system. They have first round where it's free for all. There's 4 major candidates. And if you don't win 50%, you have to go to a second round. And then that's where the 2 top contenders will run. And on that second round, if Erdogan loses, they can go to the YSK and say, find me the votes, like Trump did with Georgia. Only the YSK actually will find the votes or invalidate the votes or say that there was some sort of irregularity that would allow them to call the election again. There's also the outside chance that Erdogan loses the presidency, but the AKP holds parliament. And then parliament, held by the AKP, then votes for a new poll to try to get their president back in and tries to invalidate it. There's the more dire situations, like you mentioned, where he could try to use emergency powers, order the army into the streets, order the police into the streets to try to say, this is a stolen election, it's a foreign plot, etc. I think a lot of people are alarmed by that. But we don't think that will be the first go-to. They will escalate their way of election denial, starting with the electoral board, maybe going to the courts, which again they control. The Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court of Turkey, is full of AKP loyalists, and they would probably rule in favor of whatever court cases they brought to them. They'll go that path first because that's the least volatile, the least pushback. If they go to the path of internal coup, it's not outside of the realm of possibility. It's obviously a hallmark of Turkish political history, but it's high risk because there's no guarantee that the military will go along with it or that enough of the military will go along with it for it to be successful. And the last thing Erdogan wants to do is to go back to jail.
Yeah, literally while we're talking, somebody sent me a poll that has Kılıçdaroğlu at 48 and Erdogan at 45. So that would go to a second round, but also showing you some distance, at least in the polls for the opposition candidate. But it's very hard to trust these things in general. In that scenario that you described about, let's say AKP, wins in parliament, and then you get to the second round. Do you think that AKP loyalists would be willing to do that, to basically subvert democracy in that way? I mean, the example you used with the Republican Party, a lot of the reason Trump didn't succeed in what he was trying to do was because Mike Pence said no. And there were different Republican officials who said, no, this is still a democracy. We're not going to just find you the votes. Do you think that Erdogan would ever get in a position where he wouldn't have the votes and AKP officials would be like, look, we have parliament, so they're not going to overturn all of the changes that we've made recently here, but we're also not just going to, self-immolate Turkish democracy to have one person in power, a person who has shown some signs of health concerns, things like that. Is that anywhere within the realm of possibility, or am I being too naive and optimistic?
My dog is barking. You can't hear that, right?
We appreciate all analysis from all forms of life here on the podcast. Okay. So if the listeners can hear it, it was brilliant. And if they can't, they really missed out.
Okay. All right. I just want to be sure. The analogy with Trump, I think, is useful. It's not a perfect analogy. Of course, as analysts, we tend to think of these trying to find one-to-one comparisons. The Trump comparison, though, is useful because if you imagine Trump having controlled the Republican Party for 20 years and with his personality dynamics of purging disloyal people over multiple election cycles, the analogy gets closer. And that's what Erdogan's had the chance to do, is to purge these disloyal elements. We have AKP splinter parties. Ali Babakan is a good example of an AKP old guard who's tired of Erdogan and now has splinter parties. And there's a lot of AKP officials as well as grassroots voters that have switched to the opposition and haven't changed their ideology, but they just don't like this guy anymore. And as a result, that's left the AKP much more loyal to Erdogan as a person, seeing him as the personality that leads this neo-Ottoman project to restore Turkey's greatness. And so there's a higher risk that this AKP, as opposed to the AKP in, say, 2010 or 2015 or any other previous elections, probably would be more likely to go along with it and try to support a subversion of the electoral process. That I think that risk is higher. It's still not guaranteed. And I think the reason that it's not guaranteed, and this is so interesting, 2019, they lost Istanbul, the AKP did. They lost Ankara in these mayoral races. And Erdogan said, whoever has Istanbul controls the future of Turkey. He drew a red line and they reran the election and they lost twice and then they accepted it. And that's where there's uncertainty is introduced because they should have brought out the tanks or they should have bagged up these opposition mayors and had them disappear to some black site. That's where they should have done their authoritarian shenanigans as a test run for future elections. Instead, they let those seats go. And that's where it's hard to say they have the capability to go that far level to subvert democracy completely. They had it in 2019 and they chose not to exercise it. And that seems to be that the calculation is that the population wouldn't go along with it. Parts of the army would not go along with it. NATO wouldn't go along with it. The EU wouldn't go along with it. And you could end up with sanctions that could heavily damage the Turkish economy at a very vulnerable moment. And that could turn your remaining loyalists against the party itself. Erdogan is in a really tricky position where he's built an autocracy that's very hollow. It doesn't have that steel bones of institutional strength the way that, say, Putin's Russia does, to be able to pull off these shenanigans and have a clear result that he can count on. If Erdogan does it, it will be a gamble, and there will be an uncertain outcome on the far side of it.
Yeah, one could argue a hollow autocracy is not much of an autocracy at all. And for better and for worse, I still have some faith in Turkish democracy, although I must admit that faith is being tested in real time. Before we leave Turkey, I want to pick at one more scenario, which is, let's say opposition wins. Let's say Kılıçdaroğlu at whatever round wins. He has made some pretty intense promises about reversing basically everything that Erdogan has put into power, whether it's Turkey's foreign policy, the executive presidency, all these other things. Do you think that he can actually do any of those things, or do you think that Turkish foreign policy won't change very much based on who's pulling the levers at the top level?
So on the foreign policy level, Turkey is stuck as a middle power, which means it is strong enough to bully small states and not strong enough, or it's strong enough to bully, smaller countries like Syria, but it can't stand up to like bigger macro geopolitical events like the events in Ukraine, things like that. It can manipulate events, but it can't shape them. So if Kılıçdaroğlu is made president and he does get control of the parliament, they will be stuck with the same problems that Erdogan has. They may not have the neo-Ottoman impulses of trying to restore Greater Turkey and things like that. They may not have those, and they certainly won't have those on a domestic front. They won't be able to say, abandon the Syria strategy, the Syria policies, because if they reverse what Erdogan has been doing in Syria and move out of the buffer zones, they invite millions more refugees to come into Turkey, and that'll be incredibly unpopular. So they won't do that. They can't stop military operations in Iraq so long as the Kurdish militants, the PKK, launch attacks from there. Their relations with the West will still be tense because maybe they get rid of the S-400 and they send it on to Ukraine, or they dump it and that makes the Americans very happy. But they still need Russian energy. They need Russian grain. They need working relations with the Russians. And they still need to, and they're still going to cause trouble in the Caucasus with Azerbaijan, because they certainly can't abandon Azerbaijan after it's gained so much success. That'll upset Turkish nationalists that would still be part of the base. So on a foreign policy level, it would probably be less seismic than on the domestic level. And then on the domestic level is a question of how much power do they really have? If they have 3/5 majority in parliament, which is very unlikely, but if they have 3/5 supermajority in parliament, they can roll back the executive presidency. They can go back to the old parliamentary system. If they don't, they're stuck with Erdogan's system, with a seething, angry Erdogan and AKP desperately trying to cause an early election and trying to retake power that way, which would be that would be the democratic path for Erdogan, is to just spend the next 5 or so years undermining this government and trying to retake the structures that he set up.
Yeah, you mentioned Turkish dependence on Russia, and I want to push back there a little bit because, dependent on Russian grain, okay, but there are plenty of American farmers and Canadian farmers who would love to export to the Turkish market. Dependent on Russian energy, yes, but we've got a lot of natural gas coming on from the Black Sea. Oil prices are below 70. There's plenty of shale out there that, the U.S., other countries want to export. There's plenty of LNG apparently out there that folks want to export as well. That at least seems to be one area where you could see a shift, where Turkey could not be as complacent or as pragmatic or as neutral if you had the opposition candidate win. But I have trouble telling myself that story and really believing it. But I'll throw that scenario at you and see if you tell me that I'm completely off my rocker or if there's anything there.
Well, this is what goes to a strategic disadvantage the United States has as a free market, is that we do have these resources to provide to allies. We rarely deploy them strategically. Now, of course, Cold War, they put the wheat towards the Soviets. They were doing that as part of détente. If the Biden administration and Congress could work together to subsidize farmers to make the prices right for Turkey, then sure, you could see that. But our internal politics are problematic at the moment. Whereas the Russian system is united. If Putin wants to set a price for gas or oil or wheat and give it to the Turks at that level, he has the leverage to do so. And that unless that dynamic shifts, unless the U.S. gets to be a lot more strategic in how it deploys its resource base, Turkey will go with whoever's cheaper. And at the moment, the Russians are offering discounts. And that doesn't mean that they like the Russians. They've fought several proxy wars with them in Syria and shot down one of their jets in 2015. But the Turks are cheap, and they are like any other buyer on the global market. They are looking for the cheapest goods possible, especially core commodities like oil and wheat.
Great. Well, let's turn to the Gulf. The Gulf is probably the part of the Middle East. Saudi and Emiratis and Qataris. They just bore me because it feels like nothing changes. But a lot has been changing recently. I haven't been able to just sit there and be bored lately because you've got Saudi Arabia and Iran making nice. And maybe we're going to welcome Syria back into the fold with the GCC behind that. And even Qatar's been brought in back from the cold. You recently wrote a piece on Rain that I just read about the selection of a new crown prince in the UAE, and sort of tensions between the UAE and Saudi Arabia are also very hard to sort of get to the bottom with. So when we're thinking about some of the major changes that are happening in the Gulf, help our listeners sort of orient themselves. What is changing? What isn't changing? And how do you think about this region going forward, especially in a world where the United States is producing its own oil, and it's really Asian countries like China and India and Japan, South Korea that are becoming dependent on those Middle Eastern oil supplies?
Right. I guess one of the areas that's changing the most is the fractures in the global oil market and global energy market caused by the Russian-Ukrainian war. It used to be, the Cold War, you did have two oil markets. You had East versus West. You could buy Soviet oil by being a communist, or you could buy American oil or Saudi oil by being a capitalist. And we're sort of shifting a little bit back towards that, which really benefits countries like Saudi and the UAE and Qatar, because they're able to still sell to everybody. And that kind of gives us an idea of, if you want a barometer of the emergence of the multipolar world order, you can stick it right in Riyadh. And that's a place where you can sense how countries are viewing what is smart geopolitics in the 21st century. For Riyadh, it is not picking sides. It is Saudi first. It is prioritizing their internal development. It is selling oil to the Chinese for as long as they possibly can. It's cooperating with the Russians for price stability, and it's buying guns from the Americans at scale for as long as they'll let you do that. And it's leveraging your position as an energy producer to avoid pushback from anybody when you invariably upset them with your independent foreign policy. It's about Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, all learning to live without the aegis of the United States in the region. And we've seen, these seismic events like the Iranian attack on Abqaiq in 2019 was a demonstration that America will not ride to the rescue for the Gulf Arabs anymore. Americans are tired of dying in wars for oil or whatever appears to be wars for oil. And so these Gulf Arabs are on their own. And as a former expatriate of the United Arab Emirates, I know that it is a dream of many expats to see the Gulf Arabs have to sink or swim on their own. And they are moving into that moment where their development models, their political models, their strategic models, their defense strategies are all going to work if they can make them work. And if they can't, we're already seeing consequences for that. Abqaiq 2019 was a good one. The Houthis attacked Abu Dhabi, never happened before. That was a wake up to the Emiratis. In fact, there was a good article that just came out about how the Emiratis, they didn't turn to the Americans for their air defense after that attack. They turned to the Israelis. And the Israelis provided them with this new Spider air defense system, because the Emiratis normalized with the Israelis, not because it made America happy, but because the Israelis have great air defenses and great intelligence, and the Emiratis need a replacement for the Americans, who are no longer as reliable. At the same time, there's a lot of folks that say, China's going to take over. This is a new Cold War. Everything that China does out there is a net loss for the U.S. But we tend to frame it as America's losing interest. Like you said, it's a boring region sometimes because politics doesn't change and we don't get elections and they don't make a lot of moves necessarily all the time. But at the same time, the Chinese moves, as glacial as they are about this development of interdependence and independence and making a more complicated map, one that's harder for people to fit into their political boxes. And I think that's probably the most dynamic, most interesting part of the Gulf, is that it was such a reliable pro-Western bloc. Now it's becoming selfish. And I don't think people necessarily know how to frame that narrative.
Well, and we'll get to excuse me, we'll get to Iran in a second here, but what you said about the Emiratis and the Saudis sinking or swimming on their own policies, I really want to hit on Saudi Arabia there, because Mohammed bin Salman has these grand plans and Vision 2030, and they're going to make all these. But for a country that geopolitically speaking really doesn't have a lot going for it, like yes, Saudi Arabia has oil, but you go down the rest of the geopolitical checklist. I mean, water, we don't have that. Like modern industry, don't have that. Sure, they buy lots of weapons. Where are the soldiers that are actually going to use the weapons? Its society is really, I mean, it's sort of this weird, unholy alliance between Wahhabi clerics and tribes that are kind of going back and forth. None of that is the recipe you would think for a country that's going to do particularly well going forward. And yet they have these plans, it looks like, to become a modern, sophisticated, more culturally open business center in the Middle East. Is that possible? Marco Papic, another Stratfor alum, has been on this podcast, and he has said, he's looking at Saudi Arabia as I think he actually compared it to the Meiji Restoration, and I sort of didn't know what to say when he said that, because it seemed so silly. But I mean, Mohammed bin Salman's made more progress than I ever thought. I thought when he started locking up Saudi princes in hotels and shaking them down for money that he wasn't going to last very long. But not only has he lasted, he seems to be getting stronger by the year. And some of the things that we're talking about here seem to be coming to fruition for Saudi Arabia. So is it all a mirage, or are you more optimistic about Saudi's future?
Oh, well, it's always fun to watch your years go by. 7 years is not very long for 2030 now. And it's been 7 years since they declared it, but it seemed like the distant future at the time. And in that time, you have seen probably what the mixed bag of Saudi future development is going to be kind of unfold. Neom, the super city they're going to build with a massive line, that'll be a bizarro tourist attraction. It could be a white elephant. I am willing to bet that its population is going to be nowhere near their projections for 2030. Besides, tourists popping through and journalists, having to do the junkets there. They're going to definitely miss big on some of these projects, and they will miss big on things like Saudiization within the economy. Getting Saudis to work in the private sector is a Herculean task, because, you and I as Americans, we've been brutalized by capitalism to do our jobs. Saudis, on the other hand, are not. And that's part of their social contract, is that it's never too difficult to necessarily maintain your standard of living in these Gulf Arab states. And they've been trying to find subtle ways to convince people, but it won't work. Human nature is, we will do what is easiest. And I would behave no differently if I knew that my unemployment benefits were so assured as they are in Saudi Arabia. So they will struggle on some of those fronts. On the other hand, Dubai gives hope that there is a governance model and an economic model that can work. It's based on tourism. It's based on technology. It's based on developing very hyper-specific comparative advantages. The most recent one for Dubai is hosting Russian oligarchs that desperately want to find a place to put their rubles, so they're dumping into the Palm Jumeirah. So nobody in Dubai could have planned for the oligarch surge in part of their development model. So all that a place like Saudi Arabia can do is try to plan as many plans as it can to be as useful as it can for a future it doesn't know. Now, as you noted, water is a problem. Technology can solve water problems. Hence the reason that they may end up normalizing with the Israelis, who are fantastic with their water management. Yeah. That would be an area that they would have, a great incentive to build relations with. On the other hand, Israel, as we may talk about a little bit later, may go in a direction where normalizing is not achievable for the Saudis. And then in that case, they may end up with a water crisis. They may end up with existential challenges that make it so that they have to shrink their development model. They have to shrink their ambitions. They have to just basically survive the rest of the 21st century until external developments come along that might allow them to improve their situation. In 2030, I fully expect it to be a 50-50 scorecard. Some things will be great and some things will be terrible. People will be impressed by amusement parks and possibly some headquarters move to Riyadh. On the other hand, people will be like, I knew it, when they point to like Jeddah Tower, that's supposed to be the tallest tower of the world and it won't be completed. And they'll be like, yeah, that figures. But at the same time, that doesn't mean Saudi revolution. It doesn't mean the collapse of the monarchy. But the other problem is, over time, if Vision 2030 doesn't work out, if the development projects don't work out, Saudi Arabia's political economy will get poorer and poorer and poorer. And that is a recipe for change. And How does that unfold is hard to say. Forecasting the end of the Saudi monarchy is an industry in and of itself. Uh, there is a possibility that they navigate the next few decades with their authority intact, uh, but they will probably have to take advantage of geopolitical events happening beyond and get lucky several times and have allies that are willing to bail them out when things go wrong, in addition to building up their own resiliency. But I'm not going to call it utopia, and I wouldn't call it Mad Max Armageddon either. But I think it will be disappointing in some regards to some people, and it will also be impressive in what they do achieve to others.
Yeah, apparently they're also going to have competitive advantage with soccer and golf, and I don't know what their next sports are that they're going to try and produce there too. And maybe that the world will respect them because all the great sports athletes are going to go there and get paid hundreds of millions of dollars. I'm not sure. Well, let's talk about the elephant in the room, though, because the historical power in this part of the world is not Arab sheiks in Riyadh. It's Iran. I mean, Iran is sitting there. It's a global pariah in part because of its own domestic politics, in part because it challenged the U.S. at the wrong moment instead of waiting for the multipolar era. It did it during the unipolar era. I mean, we can kind of go into why Iran is backed into the way that it is, but in general, I mean, this is Iran's sphere of influence. When Iran is powerful, usually it's the one that is dictating things here. And when it's coming into problems, it's usually coming into problems with Turkey, not necessarily with Arab states around it that are so strong. So how do you, in the context of all that, how do you explain this Saudi-Iranian rapprochement, and where do you think we go from here?
Well, rapprochement or détente was definitely done at the end of an Iranian drone. The Iranians have proven, and even as recently as I think a week or two ago, they can grab tankers in the Gulf. They can hit Saudi cities through their proxies. They can hit Emirati cities. They can hit the Israelis. They can shoot at American soldiers, and they can do this really sophisticated harassment strategy against all their rivals that turns up the temperature without exploding. And they've actually turned it into an art form. I remember in 2019, we used to run around in a panic whenever a Gulf tanker was grabbed, because we were like, what's President Trump going to do? Is he going to nuke Iran? And the Iranians in that era were experimenting. Now they're experts at it. And this is an era where the Gulf Arabs are coming to terms with this is where they live. If they want their development models to work, if they want intelligent professionals from the rest of the world to move to Riyadh or Abu Dhabi and help run their economies, they can't have Iranian drones hitting their cities every couple of weeks. They certainly can't have in the news headlines that Iran's about to attack Saudi Arabia or the UAE. So détente makes a lot of sense because their development models matter more to them than the sectarian and geopolitical rivalry with Iran, which they can't really win anyway. As you said, they are not the bigger power. Their populations are too small. Their resource bases are too small. Their economies aren't developed, and they're totally reliant on the United States for defense. And the U.S. doesn't want to go to war with Iran. The U.S. fought 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, both Iran's neighbors. I guess you could call Iraq a half victory, given how things have gone. But they definitely lost in
That's very
Afghanistan.
kind of you. I would call that an out and out defeat.
That was, but the Americans didn't do well in either of those countries and have no interest in repeating it in Iran. And so the Iranians have learned how to rattle everybody's cages without causing the nuclear option, including to the Israelis, who are probably as sophisticated, if not more sophisticated, on the covert level, and certainly a better conventional military power against the Iranians. And in that context, the Gulf Arabs have to learn how to get the Iranians to stop rattling their cages because they need those folks to move there. They need the investment to come in. They need the tourists to show up. And if that means giving the Iranians symbolic victories as well as real victories, like just accepting that Iran is going to be the major power in a place like Lebanon and that, Saudi's proxies there have no say and there's nothing Saudi can do about it. If that's the trade-off, I think Riyadh is willing to make that. In Abu Dhabi, they have this dream of building a South Yemen to turn it into a proxy state and, and have ports there and tourism and split the country in half. They're paring back those ambitions too, because that was why Abu Dhabi got hit by the Houthis, was because of their involvement there. So they're paring back ambitions. They're going back to their borders, and they're hoping that the Iranians are too constrained by other geopolitical events to go after them anymore.
And where do you see Iran in, well, let's say out to 2030? Do you think that, obviously a lot is going to depend on when Khamenei passes away. Like for all we know, he could be around for another 7 years. And it seems like a lot of the internal conflict within Iran is going to get shaken out when you get that next transition at the supreme leader level. But you've kind of explained what the Gulf states get out of rapprochement with Iran. It's less clear to me what Iran gets out of this whole situation. How do you see that, and how do you see Iran? I would think they would be jealous of these development models. They would want to be the country that's having all this development and be the economic center of gravity in the region.
Right. And, if Iran could ever get out from underneath the U.S. sanctions net, they probably would be. They'd be one of the most dynamic economies in the region. They'd be rivaling with Turkey, maybe with some of Turkey's own, political dysfunction as well, like running inflation too hot, things like that. But Iran would be a dynamic powerhouse if it could get out of the sanctions net. Ideologically, it's trapped in a position where it can't negotiate in a way that it would get out of the sanctions net. So it's kind of stuck with that position. But what the Iranians are getting out of détente with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, one, it's interesting because the Iranians have gone into Ukraine. That's now a front for them as well. It's not a massive front. It's not as important to them as, say, Syria or Lebanon or even Yemen. But it is now yet another proxy theater that they are involved with, and that is a drain on resources. They're trying to prop up the Russians and make sure that war effort doesn't collapse with what limited tools they've got. So they're trying to maintain good relations with the Russians and maintain support from the Russians. And that results in them having a little bit less firepower to use against the Gulf Arab states. So some of it's pragmatism, military pragmatism, that if they want to continue their proxy strategy that has now expanded to Ukraine, they do have to pick their target better. And it's not really clear what more drone attacks on Saudi Arabia would necessarily win them at this point, other than international ire and the potential that the United States finally does get sick of it and launches retaliatory strikes on Iran itself. And of course, Saudi's relationship with China also matters. It's no accident that China was the one that brokered the détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Not only could the Americans never do so because they're hated by the Iranians, but the Chinese very much want these Gulf Arab oil markets to be stable. And in that sense, since China is one of the prime purchasers of Iranian oil, despite sanctions, they're one of their major trade partners. On a defense level, there could be greater cooperation there in the future, and Iran would like nothing more than to get some Chinese military bases inside of Iran as a further security guarantor. Iran has a strong interest in making sure that China's opinion matters, or that China's opinion is positive of them. So the Iranians are a multifaceted and interesting system where they've got like multiple political poles. They have their ideological wing, which is pushing them into these proxy theaters. Possibly people say that it's imperial overreach, but there is a constraint on them that they can only be in so many proxy theaters effectively at a given time. That's one area to consider. And then, of course, there's also the domestic constraints. There's a rising tide of younger people who don't like the system. They don't want to wear the hijab. They are connected on the internet. They haven't liked the system for 10, 15 years. And there's only so much power that they can deploy to keep that restive generation under control. So they're learning to do trade-offs. They're trying to not compromise their ideology as much as possible, while at the same time dealing with the world that they live in. The harassment strategy is a good example of that. They're still fighting their rivals, but without causing wars that they would lose. And that's kind of that marriage between IRGC, hardline ideology, and your Rouhani kind of let's still speak to the Westerners in spite of the fact that we don't really care for them.
I saw somebody sent me a great map. I think it was yesterday. That's sort of, or I'm sorry, it was a chart, and it was number of countries, or it was like proportion of global GDP that is under U.S. sanctions right now, and it just keeps on going up and to the right. So I think that your point about Iran is that when it's Russia by itself, that's a pariah state. When it's China by itself, that's a pariah state. North Korea by itself, add in Iran to that, now we're starting to talk a little bit. Like, let's add in a Venezuela, let's add in a South Africa. Like, suddenly you start to get the picture of certainly not an order that's going to be near as rich as sort of some of the other multipolar orders in the world, but it starts to get kind of more realistic. And you also mentioned, China needs the oil markets in the Middle East to be stable. Good luck, Beijing. I wish you all the best of luck in managing that going forward. Before we move to Syria, I think the reason we actually ended up connecting on this was because we were not debating, but talking back and forth about Israel's most recent elections. And I did a solo episode on this a couple of weeks ago, and I think most listeners know that I'm pretty pessimistic about Israeli geopolitics in general. But I thought I'd just kind of ask, because you mentioned Israel as being a very sophisticated covert actor here. I think that the region I would be very scared if I was an Israeli strategic decision maker. And I'd be scared, number one, because the environment's much more uncertain. You can't just rely on the United States and everything's going to go fine. And number two, domestically, Israel's coming apart at the seams, it looks to me. And, there's a reason that in history, Jewish control over the land that is Palestine, whatever the politically correct words that are, I want to insert them there. I don't want to offend anyone, but there's a reason that Jewish control over that part of the world doesn't happen very often. The planets all have to align in a perfect sort of line, and then the Jewish forces themselves have to not be fighting with each other the whole time, to be subject to external forces. And in some ways, the most disturbing thing about Israel's geopolitical future is today, modern Israel, I mean, the society is squabbling with itself. It looks like you're getting real cleavages in the society. You're not going to get that kind of societal unity that you would need in this more kind of this more difficult and volatile world that is coming at them. So I guess that's not a question. I'll just throw it up you to say, where do you see Israel going? How does Israel work into all this? Because it looks, if it was just the external problems, you could sort of see how Israel can play that. But it's very hard for me to see how Israel balances the external issues with the internal issues and going back and forth between them.
Right. And, I think what sparked our initial conversation was talking about how, American millennials, there's a poll saying that they're losing the
Yeah.
luster of Israel. For the first time, they think they have more sympathy for the Palestinians, according to Gallup, than the Israelis. And that is a shift. And I think it's emblematic of that multipolar world. We can go, and I'm sure you've talked about this before, going back to why does America care about Israel? The best strategic reason was that it helped counter the Soviets backed Arab states of Syria and Egypt way back in the day. There was a clear rationale. Soviets are gone. Syria has eaten its own tail, or burned itself alive. The Egyptians are an American ally who can't fuel their tanks without American military aid. That argument doesn't make sense anymore. Now the Iranians still do, right? It's a mutual enemy. They're both concerned about it. The Israelis will take risks that the Americans won't. They'll gather intelligence that the Americans won't. That is still a driver. But there's always an open question of, how much does the United States care about Iran if it also doesn't care about Israel, especially if Iran is making nice with the Gulf Arab states and making sure that oil is able to get out. At what point does that cause a strategic divergence? And then there's, as you mentioned, the identity crisis. Lots of ultra-Orthodox people within Israel having kids, a lot of secular Jews that are not. That is going to cause a demographic reckoning in the 2040s or 2050s where the ultra-Orthodox would be a plurality or even a majority of the population. They are not, the Israeli economic ministers and the central bank are all like, we need to find ways to integrate the ultra-Orthodox into the economy and get them into schools and get them the skills that they need so that we can meet the 21st century. And that is a political nightmare to do. As a former resident of Brooklyn, I can tell you that it is very difficult to navigate that political landscape of how do you get a religious community to secularize. Particularly when they're well organized and they elect politicians and they control elections as they do so well with the ultra-Orthodox parties within Israel. And then I guess the last thing is Israel, our overlying assumption is that Israel is drifting towards a one-state solution. Like Trump overtly said the quiet part out loud, and he said, hey, there's a one-state solution peace plan. And the Israelis are slow walking towards it. The problem is that even the Israelis themselves, their plan for the Palestinians is political, not strategic. And what it looks like it'll end up being is something like a reservation system where the Palestinians have no political rights and they have no freedom of movement, and they have no economy whatsoever, and they're just left in limbo while Israeli settlements are built up around them. And that's going to make the apartheid accusation stick a bit better. And it's also going to look strategically unnecessary to outside actors like the United States. Like, why are you doing this? Oh, because your elections keep dictating that this should be the outcome. Why should we be tolerating that? So on and so forth. And it increases that debate. And if Israel doesn't have a strategic utility, like it did against Soviet-backed Syria, it becomes easier in Washington to criticize the country. And that shift in sentiment is so interesting to look at, because it's not the same as saying they're going to sanction Israel into oblivion and that they're going to help the Jordanians run them into the sea or anything like that. But it doesn't mean that the Israelis aren't going to be developing a defense industry with, say, the Saudis, with the Chinese, with, God help us, the Russians by the 2040s or 2050s, because their defense relationship with the United States may have broken down or may have become nuanced or may become complicated the way that, say, Turkey and the United States' defense relationship is complicated, and then Turkey feels the need to develop backups to its NATO alliance.
Yeah. I mean, you described integrating the ultra-Orthodox as a political nightmare. I would describe it as science fiction. It's not going to happen. You're not going to integrate them. You're not going to convince them to do anything different. The founders of Israel thought that the ultra-Orthodox were a dying breed, that they would eventually go away and that their ideas would be considered antiquated and they didn't need to worry about them. And in some ways, that was their biggest strategic mistake. They didn't realize that, no, actually, in the long run, they see a longer game here than you, and you can't just ignore them because they'll eventually outnumber you. And you mentioned about the plurality coming by 2040. If the Israeli left or the Israeli center is not going to deal with the 20% of the population that is Arab and the parties and that they send or want to send into the Knesset, well, then that religious plurality in some ways is already here. That's why Bibi keeps winning elections, because he just keeps on assembling the same plurality. And the only moment where you had this weird, we wouldn't call Naftali Bennett center or left, but he led some kind of coalition with the help of Arab parties to try and make things a little bit different. But the questions of I remember now the question about the millennials was why we connected on Twitter, and I said smugly to you in the way you can only be smug on Twitter. You can't actually talk like we're talking right now on Twitter. I said, it doesn't matter what the millennials think. Speaking as a geriatric millennial myself, it matters about hardcore interests. And the U.S., like, yes, you don't have the Soviet Union anymore, but if you've got Turkey and Iran rising and you want to balance in the region, Israel's strategic real estate, you can imagine some new argument for having Israel sort of existing between them. But, I think you're right to point out that the millennial American experience is very different than the millennial Israeli experience, that they're
Right.
completely different things. For the American millennial, we were listening to, Third Eye Blind and all these great bands, and everything was great, and the world was going to be ours, and there was going to be peace. And that's not what Israeli millennials experience. They were going through the intifadas and serving in the military, and in some ways they're very jaded. And I think there is this kind of break between them. I don't know how to explain the media's focus on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It's depressing. It's terrible. I, in some ways, feel worse for the Palestinians than almost any group I feel for in the world, because everybody takes advantage of them. The Israelis take advantage of them. The other Arab states take advantage of them, and their own leaders take advantage of them, and nobody actually stands up and fights for them. And I don't want to do comparative suffering here, but we've got a civil war in Sudan. We've got a civil war in Ethiopia. We've got famine in the Horn of Africa. We've got Uyghurs in Xinjiang. We've got the Rohingya in Myanmar. Like, when you start to go down the list of like really horrible things that we should be spending as much time talking about, and we don't, but it's all about, the Israelis and the Palestinians again. It's like, how many years of evidence do we need to see that this whole Israeli-Palestinian issue, it doesn't even matter to all the countries in the regions. That's why it's so depressing to be a Palestinian, because no one gives a crap. And I don't know. I think you're exactly right. Like, the future, not only has nobody cared about the Palestinians, like their future, what future do they have? Palestine's going to be a couple areas where they let them live as a majority, like you said, with limited rights, and then the Israelis are going to take everything else over, and it just seems like nothing is really reversible there. So maybe
Right.
that causes the United States and some of these other countries to reconsider ties with Israel, but it didn't cause them to say, well, we don't like the Saudis chopping people's hands off in the street, so we're not going to buy that. Or like it's just a difficult thing figuring out which ideological points are going to matter to people at a given point in time.
Right. But I will say, Israelis, Israel's a very small country, about the size of New Jersey, and every Israeli is aware, and they are aware of how fragile the state is, as opposed to Americans who can blasé their way through 20 years of war and barely notice outside of their newscasts. Israelis are aware that the survival of their country is tied to, foreign support. It is tied to good relations with their neighbors. And if those start to get upended, that's where you see pragmatism rise, at least in the past. Now, what we don't know is whether or not this rising, millennial Israelis, like you said, you're perfectly right to say, Israelis had a rough time of it. They saw the millennials saw the Gaza withdrawal in 2005, and they thought, okay, this is going to be a nice concession. Instead, Hamas took over and now is helping carry out rocket fire and recurrent wars. So having that level of cynicism makes a great deal of sense. It's a question of whether or not how these future Israelis would respond to, say, a George H.W. type who says, you know what, my politics has changed. It would probably be a Democratic president, I would imagine. But a future Democratic president in the 2030s or 2040s says, you know what, my constituents don't care if I send you military aid unless you do X, Y, and Z for your Palestinian policies. I can be the president that finally solves this issue. And if you don't do it, I'll cut you off. And I, say Iran is no longer as important, or Iran has helped stabilize the oil market, and therefore its ideology may not matter as much to the Americans. The United States could have fought a war with China by then, and they simply have no interest in the Middle East. Who knows what the geopolitics of that era would look like, but there could be a moment where the Americans try to pressure Israel. And then it's a question of, will the traditional Israeli pragmatism rise up, or will this more ideological, religious nationalist population that we see emerging in the current government, will they say, like Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, has said, we don't need anybody, we can take care of ourselves. And we both know that's not quite true. But some people will choose to believe that. And I guess we don't have the answer to that question. We just have the scenarios of what's likely to happen by, in 15, 20 years down the line.
Well, and I mean, again, I'm being very cynical about this because it's hard for me to be anything but cynical about Israel, probably because I'm a little too close to it to be as objective as I normally am. But that's why Israel needs Iran to be a boogeyman in some sense, because if Iran and the United States make up, it's not just that, Israel's worried about them getting nuclear weapons. It's that the whole strategic logic of the Israeli-U.S. relationship goes away if Turkey and Iran are balancing a regional balance of power. What purpose does Israel serve if the United States really is worried more about, a New Jersey-sized island in the South China Sea rather than a New Jersey, sized little strip in the Middle East, which, that you can hear the cynicism there because Netanyahu's done a very good job of developing Iran as he's the guy who can resist against Iran. He's the one who's been identifying the threat very early on. And that message has resonated, I think, with a large portion of the Israeli electorate.
And the other, near-term immediate challenge for the Israelis is that their relationship with the United States is getting more and more partisan with each electoral cycle. The Democrats are becoming the party of the Palestinians. Republicans are becoming the party of Netanyahu. If that continues, by the end of the decade, you could have dramatically different U.S. policy towards Israel based on who's president, based on who's in Congress. And that also, even a moment like with the Iron Dome vote, I think that was last year, the year before, maybe it was in 2021, where they briefly blocked an Iron Dome vote that shocked all the Israelis across the spectrum that the Americans could dare do something. It didn't end up sticking. They sent it anyway. But moments like that could become policy based on who's in charge. And that also will be a telling moment to see how Israeli governments decide to react to it, because they could say, we'll just wait for the Republican. That's eventually going to happen. We'll eventually get our guy back into office. Or if it scares them, sort of in a certain state, scares them strategically straight and starts to develop more pragmatic policies that would shore up that relationship. Or do they develop alternative backups? China, Saudi, Turkey, all of those countries, they could develop defense relationships with on a deeper level if the United States has decided that it has simply lost interest with the Israelis.
Yeah. Last topic before I let you get out of here. Syria, which I have to confess, I haven't really thought about Syria in and of its own right for quite some time. The last time I really remember thinking about Syria, I was still at Stratfor, and I remember John Kerry had just come out and he was thundering away about how the Syrians had crossed the red line on chemical weapons usage and that the United States was going to get involved. And I remember I forget if it was MSNBC or I went on some interview and I said, well, this shows that the United States is about to intervene in the Syrian conflict. And that made me look really bad because Obama walked it back and there was no red line. And I tell that story all the time to remind listeners that I may be smart, but I don't get things right near 100% of the time. I'm good enough if I get them 51% of the time. But I mean, ever since then, Syria has just been really a morass, a really depressing morass of civil war. There hasn't really been any kind of real movement, different proxies on all sides doing their own thing, but nobody really has an upper hand. But the last couple of weeks, I feel like we're getting the first real sign, and it's coming out of the Gulf, it looks like, that the Arab states want to rehabilitate Syria. They want to bring Syria back into the fold, and they're willing to stomach Bashar al-Assad for as long as Bashar al-Assad is with us. And if you start putting Syria back on the table, well, that's very interesting because that's a country that has to be rebuilt. That's a country of tens of millions of people. It's a country that has historically projected plenty of power and influence throughout the region. So are we looking at Syria coming in from the cold? Is it a little bit too early to be thinking in those terms? Even if it does, is it just going to be a proxy battleground? Give me a little bit of orientation with Syria, because I confess it's been a while for me.
So, I mean, the normalization process is happening on a diplomatic level, and it's bilateral, so it's country to country. And it's because a lot of these countries have pragmatic problems that engagement with Syria can solve. One of them, Jordan just killed the Syrian Captagon Pepe Escobar the other day in an airstrike. And it was right after they had voted to readmit them to the Arab League. And that was probably either a quid pro quo or Amman calculated that Syria would not escalate in response after having done the goodwill of the Arab League. So Captagon is a major problem. Damascus makes tons of Captagon. It floods the Gulf Arabs. It floods Jordan. Highly addictive. And they want to combat that. The only way you're going to do that is to deal with the government that does exist within Syria, that is Bashar al-Assad. The other thing is, for the most part, many of these governments didn't exactly object to Assad crushing the rebellion. They objected to Assad being allied to the Iranians. But now that Assad has come out on top, they have to work to rebuild relations with Assad to see if they can get ways to, I think my headset just died.
Oh, you're good.
Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I still got you.
Okay. So then they're trying to pry the Syrians away from Iran, and the only way to do that is through reconstruction. And they've got plenty of money to do that. What they can't do is get past U.S. sanctions. There's still a very tight U.S. sanctions net. It doesn't cost the Americans very much to deny everybody else a trade to Syria. So the sanctions from the United States are likely to stay in place for a while. But the Gulf Arabs can try to send humanitarian aid to Syria. They can try to build up influence in Damascus and reduce Iran's ability to turn Syria into a gigantic Iranian military base. And that's another one of their goals. And then the final part is refugees. Turkey has 3 million refugees. Nativism is rising. There was the whole banana incident a few years ago where a Syrian was able to eat a banana, but an ordinary Turk felt like they couldn't afford it, and it caused mob violence on a video. These countries in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, they all host millions of Syrian refugees, and they want to send them home. They won't go home as long as the civil war is continuing, and they won't go home so long as they believe they can be conscripted into the Syrian army, or they'll be thrown into one of Assad's awful prison pits. They won't leave. And even Lebanon, that's really tried to get rid of them, has barely made a dent in their million-plus refugees over these past few years with these draconian laws to send people home. They just can't do it without causing a political scandal that they're sending people straight back to their deaths. So the way to get Damascus to ease off of those draconian policies is through engagement. So they're getting used to it. They accept that he won. They don't exactly mind his tactics, but they want Assad's support to fix their drug problems, fix their refugee problems, and become, if not pro-Arab, at least less Iran-dependent than he has been in the past. And those are long-term goals. Now, mind you, the U.S. sanctions net is still there. There's still several hundred U.S. troops in the northeast. There's several thousand Turkish troops in the north. There's still a long way to go before Syria is truly normalized. And there's an open question of, if the more Assad is normalized, how much closer does he get to the Omar al-Bashir path in Sudan? Won the civil war and, wiped out Darfur and was a genocidal maniac and survived Israeli airstrikes, but couldn't survive the factionalism that followed in the peace. He was able to win the wars but lose the peace in the classic sense. And will Gulf Arabs build up enough influence in the country where they can destabilize Assad and maybe replace him with one of his lieutenants or cause a coup d'etat in the long run? That's an open question as well.
How about the Syrian Kurds? Is there any hope for the Kurdish underdogs in the region that have carved out a little autonomous zone for themselves?
Unfortunately, I think that's where your geographic determinism kicks in. They can choose to be conquered by the Turks, or they can choose to reintegrate with Damascus once the U.S. leaves. And as Americans, we tend to leave. We will eventually withdraw from that mission. And the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, who are Kurdish dominated, they've already made a lot of connections with Damascus, preparing for that day. They would prefer it not to happen anytime soon. They would prefer it to be a slow process so that they could build a good relationship with Assad, so they still keep their autonomy and they keep their language and maybe keep their security forces. But they don't seem like they're going to get that if the U.S. pulls out anytime soon. So they're trying to delay it for as long as they can. And unfortunately, I think that Rojava, the Kurdish enclave there, is going to end up under somebody's control, probably Syria's. But if that doesn't go well, Turkey will be pretty likely to occupy it when the United States leaves.
Reminds me of the old Christopher Hitchens joke. Somebody asked him once if human beings have free will, and he said, "Of course, we have no choice." So, Ryan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I hope you'll come on again soon. And thanks. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jacob. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.